So good morning Boston and Toronto. Good afternoon Iraklio, Athens, Paris, Doha, Cape Town. Good evening to New Delhi, Tokyo, Sydney. I'm John Damilakis, and I'd like to welcome you all to the IOMP webinars. The IOMP school organizes this year a series of webinars to celebrate the International Medical Physics Week. Thank you for your great interest. We have hundreds of participants today. As you know, due to the pandemic, many congresses planned for 2020 are moving entirely online. Participation today is greater than that of most in-person scientific meetings, and this is great. The usual number of participants per session is, as you know, 200, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more. Maybe Magdalena later will inform us about the exact number of participants when this kind of information is available. I'm not planning to spend time on introductions. I'd like to ask the IOMP President, Dr. Madan Rehani, to start the webinar. Madan, the stage is yours.
Thank you, John. Happy International Medical Physics Week to all. At the outset, let me wish you all, your colleagues and families, a safe and healthy passage through this difficult time. Our best wishes for the global community and population. In our small way, we thought of using the webinar as a tool to reach out to you during this very first International Medical Physics Week. As you may have seen the description on the IOMP website, we looked at virtues and limitations of International Day and thought of moving forward with International Week, and that is International Medical Physics Week. This concept will pick up in coming years and will extend to public besides professionals. The need for training is perpetual, learning never stops. We are excited with the response, and for many, it is the time zone that creates a problem, not the intent. Without taking much of your time, I will stop here and thank you all for your participation in the webinar series of IOMP during the International Medical Physics Week. I wish to thank speakers who have agreed to share their knowledge, and in case of today, Professor Mahesh, Mahadevappa. I wish to thank Professor John Damilakis, who has put hard efforts in organizing this webinar series during this week, and the person who has worked behind the scene, Professor Magda Lenastova. On behalf of my colleague in the XCOM of IOMP, I wish you a wonderful learning experience, and once again, stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Madan. We can move now to the presentation. City systems have become very complicated lately. Several parameters have impact on image quality and dose, while several other parameters have impact only on image quality. Professor Mahadevappa Mahesh is at the Johns Hopkins University Hospital of Baltimore. The title is Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, right? In Baltimore.
Yes.
Mahesh is the author of several research articles, and his interests are in medical imaging, including computed tomography. Mahesh, before you start, I'd like to thank Professor Magdalena Stoeva. She is responsible for promotion, all technical aspects, and recording. This is important. The webinar will be available on the IOMP website after the event. So if you want to identify our mistakes, you will have the opportunity to run the video frame by frame and spot them very easily. Please don't hesitate to ask questions using the chat. Let me just test it and make sure that I can Okay, yeah, everything is here on my screen. So please ask questions using the chat. I'll try to collect, group them, and ask the speaker to provide answers. We'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. So Mahesh, you have already shared your screen with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Madan, and thank you, Magdalena. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me to this seminar. This is an important topic since we know CT scanners are used around the world more and more, and we also know as a physicist that the clinical benefits of the CT imaging has far outweighs any of the risk associated. However, as medical physicists working in hospitals, we need to know the different aspect of CT systems. So this particular webinar is going to focus on CT scan parameters and radiation dose. This is a huge topic. I'm trying to give summarize in the next 35 to 40 minutes the fundamentals of the scan parameters and also how the CT dose is measured. These are my disclosures, and these are the topics I'm going to talk. I'm going to start with what is the utilization of CT? What are the different scan parameters that are important for generating a CT image, and how it impacts radiation dose and image quality? Later part of the lecture, I'm going to spend more time on how the CT doses are measured and what are the key CT dose descriptors. So let me start with the utilization factor. Recently, we published a large report called NCRP 184. Basically, it's a radiation exposure to patients in the United States. This was published in November of this year. And this is a report basically published after 10 years, which previous report was NCRP 160. What I want to draw here your attention is the utilization of the CT and how much it is contributing to the total dose. So for example, in this particular pie chart shown here, these are the percent procedures versus individual effective dose for the US during 2016. If you look in here on the left-hand side is the percent of radiation imaging procedures performed in the US. Its account is around 311 million procedures. On the right-hand side, it'll tell you the average effective dose per capita for US population. As you can see, the CT dose contributes to a larger section of the medical imaging doses exposed to any patients. So even though CT accounts to 20% of the procedures, it accounts to nearly 63% of the collect effective dose per person for the US population. This is the background I just want to start with. So why is it so? What we have seen here is, this is the number of CT procedures performed in the US. What I want to draw your attention is, if you look here in around 1998, that is the time the multi-detector CT became commercially available in the US. Around that time, there were about approximately 26 million procedures were done annually. We would see that rapid increase in the number of CT scanners around in the next 10 years, rising almost at an annual 10 to 15%, rising up all the way to 62 million procedures and up to 85 million procedures. As of 2017, in the US, it's about 74 million procedures. This is based on a national surveys. Again, it has some uncertainty, but just it's showing the trend of the number of CT procedures done in the US. And the utilization of the CT has increased tremendously with the introduction of multi-detector CT, because a lot of new application became possible with multi-detector CT, such as cardiac CT, PET CT, and perfusion CT, and a lot more new procedures began with the introduction of multi-detector CT. The number of procedures is not just confined to US. Here is the statistical data from OECD Health Statistics in 2019 based on the data for 2017. On the top graph basically shown here is the number of CT scanners available per million of the population in different countries. You can see these are the OECD countries who participated in this survey. As you can see, Japan has the highest number of CT scanner per million population, and almost many countries which was not showing up on these statistics in the past are now beginning to show up and telling that the utilization has increased. On the bottom figure is the number of CT exams per 1,000 population. They are given a comparison between 2007 and 2017. So here, as you can see, United States has one of the highest utilization. It's about 256 CT exam per 1,000 population. So if you simply multiply by the population, 323 million population, that's come out to approximately 82 million CT exams, which kind of correlates to what we found in the NCRP 184. So what I want to show this as an introduction is the utilization has increased. And because of that, we are getting more involved clinically to help our clinician or physician colleagues how to deliver the CT image in a much better way and a more optimized way. So with that as a brief introduction, I just want to dwell directly into what are the different scan parameters. I like to group the CT scan parameters, which has an impact on radiation dose and image quality, into three different buckets called as the primary factors, secondary factors, and other factors. Given the limitation of the time, I'm not going to spend time on the secondary and the other factors. I'm going to briefly spend time on the primary factors, which is very important because they do have impact on both the radiation dose to the patient and the image quality of the patient. So the primary factors are key because if any small change in any of these primary factors will have an impact on the patient dose and also on the image quality. In the secondary factors we can find in books and papers, these secondary factors are already as like a post-processing information, like the reconstructed slice width, reconstruction interval. They do have an impact on the image quality, but not necessarily on the radiation dose because that's already inherently affected in the primary factors. The other factors are patient size, patient motion, and geometry and detector efficiency, and training and experience. Training and experience of a radiology technologist is becoming very critical, especially with the faster and faster scan, especially if we are using a contrast material for doing the scans. So let me start with the primary factors. Among the primary factors, the most fundamental factor is the tube current. Next one is tube voltage, scan time, pitch, and scan acquisition type. I'm not going to spend time explaining the scan acquisition type because that is very much focused towards cardiac CT, which is not the topic of interest today. But otherwise, I'm going to spend the time on the first four. Let me start with the tube current. The tube current, the unit of tube current is milliampere MA. And if you multiply that by the scan time, that's called the tube current time product or the MAS. So being a physicist, you all know how the X-rays are produced. And the tube current is an indication of the amount of X-ray produced in the X-ray tube. Because the tube current is the amount of energy heat you insert for the X-ray filament to heat up, which in turn produces electrons. The electrons are attracted towards the anode, which bombards with the anode to create Bremsstrahlung X-rays. So in a way, we can consider tube current MA as the amount of X-ray produced in an X-ray tube, which is an indication of the quality of X-rays. The other most commonly used terminology, MAS. MAS is basically a product of tube current times the scan time per rotation. One common feature which you need to understand is the radiation dose varies linearly with tube current, which means if you increase or decrease the tube current, the output of the X-rays increase or decrease, which in turn increases or decreases the patient dose. One of the accompanying factor with the radiation with this tube current is the image noise. If the tube current is very less, the amount of X-ray produced is very less, therefore the image noise is higher. So the fundamental is image noise decreases with increase in the tube current. I want to show you two clinical examples, which clearly tells how the tube current can be set, which is dependent on the clinical indication. Shown here are two images. On the left-hand side is a calcium score protocol image. It is a cardiac image. It's only used for calcification studies. And the right-hand side is a CT angiography. For the calcium scoring studies, typically the tube current can be set very low. Typically, we set about 50 mA tube current. Since the tube current is very low, the background noise is higher. You can see here in the heart, it's more graininess is there. However, since the final clinical indication we're looking is a calcification, the calcification shows very nicely even in the noisy background. We can get away with using a low tube current. On the other hand, on the right-hand side is a CT angiography image, where we are trying to see a subtle changes in the coronary segments like calcification or some blocking and so forth, where you want a very high signal to noise ratio. Because of that, in CT angiography, we tend to use the tube current very high, 500 mA, 800 mA, just to make sure that the signal to noise ratio is very high. So what we see here is like one fundamental fact is the radiation dose radiation dose varies linearly with tube current, which means decreasing tube current reduces radiation dose linearly. This is a very fundamental factor which is true with respect to the CT, or the same thing with the X-rays or fluoroscopy. Shown here is like the for different tube current, I've expressed this different effective dose value, which we're going to discuss later, basically showing if we keep all other factors constant, if we just simply change the tube current, the radiation dose to the patient decreases or changes linearly. Here are some sample CT X-ray tubes. They are large X-ray tube because they have to take a lot of heat units because they can be run continuously without having to stop. The second primary factor is the tube voltage. Also, the unit is kilo voltage, and this is the potential difference between the anode and cathode of an X-ray tube. You can define the tube voltage as an indicator of a quality of X-ray produced, which means the tube voltage will results in the amount how fast the electrons are attracted towards the anode, thereby creating the X-rays, and the X-rays, when they are bombarded by a high speed electrons, are more energetic. One of the common factors is the most common tube voltage used in CT has been 120 kV. If you look across most CT protocol, majority of them are all 120 kV. The reason being the energy produced at 120 kV is suitable to penetrate even the thick portion of the body, such as the shoulder area or the hip area of an average size patient. Nowadays, however, there are other kV stations are also calibrated are also used clinically. Especially the lower kV is used for thin and pediatric patient, 100 kV or 80 kV or even 70 kV. For larger patient, we are required to increase the kV to 140 or 135. One of the fundamental factors of impact of tube voltage is that tube voltage controls the image contrast and also the amount of penetration. Means you need certain amount of X-ray quality to penetrate. At the same time, we don't want too high of an energy to penetrate without causing an image contrast. The another fundamental relationship is the radiation dose or CT doses increases with tube voltage in a way not as a linear, but more as a kV square. So the radiation dose to the patient is approximately proportional to the kV square. If you decrease kV, even a small decrease in kV will have an opportunity to reduce the dose when other factors are kept constant. Here's an example based on a phantom measurement. All I want to show you and to explain here is for different kV, if you see in the third column is the percentage change in the radiation output compared to the 120 kV. So if you can see here from 120 kV to 100 kV for a head CT or a body CT, you can see quite a significant dose reduction. And that's the rationale of us going towards performing CT scan at a lower technique for a thin patient and pediatric patient. The third primary factor is the scan time. The scan time is the definition basically is the gantry rotation time, which means the amount of time the X-ray tube takes to rotate around the gantry in one single rotation. This impacts the total scan exam time. It affects the temporal resolution, and it also affects the radiation dose. One of the driving factor in CT technology to do faster and faster scan is to improve the temporal resolution needed to capture a very fast moving organ such as heart. And that's one of the reasons why we have CT scanners now capable of rotating the gantry speed to less than 300 millisecond or even 0.27 seconds or 270 millisecond. So when you say scan time, there are three different types of scan times. One is the full rotation time. The X-ray tube is on during the entire 360-degree rotation, which is normally the case in most of all the CT exams we do, where the scan time is defined as the complete the time required for the X-ray tube to rotate 360 degrees around the patient. Sometimes we also do what is called as a partial scan time. Partial scan time, especially done for cardiac CT, is done with a half scan plus the fan angle. And there is also what is called the quarter scan time. That's with the CT scanner, which has dual X-ray tube. One particular manufacturers have this type of CT scanners. That's called the Siemens dual source CT. There, the actual scan time or the amount of time required to scan a particular area can be even 1/4 of the rotation time. But generally, as I said, majority of all the CT exams we do are all done at a full rotation time. The fourth fundamental factor is the pitch. And this is very important, especially when we do a helical scan. In the absence of helical scan, the pitch concept does not arrive. So when you are doing a helical scan, imagine you are translating the patient through the gantry while the X-ray tube is turned on continuously. Thereby, the X-ray path, if you look, creates more like a helix. When you have this helical scan, there is a definition called pitch, which is basically defined as the ratio of the table feed per rotation divided by the X-ray beam width. This applies to both single detector CT and also multiple row detector CT. In a multiple row detector CT, the pitch is basically the table feed per rotation, means how much of the table is translating through the gantry per rotation divided by the total beam width. In a multi-detector CT, the total beam width is basically N times the T, where N is the number of active dash channels multiplied by T, the thickness of each dash channel. Let's imagine if you're having a 64 slice CT scanner, because 64 slice scanner and 16 slice scanners are pretty much becoming the de facto standard. Let's say 64 slice CT scanner and each of the detector width is about 0.5 millimeter width, then N sub T is equal to 32 millimeter, which means when the X-rays are acquiring this helical scan, the beam width is about 32 millimeter. If the table is also translating at 32 millimeter per rotation, then the ratio will become pitch equal to 1. There are three different scenarios. When the beam width is almost same as the table feed per rotation, that's equal to pitch of 1. That imagine this, is almost by placing block by block next in the anatomy. We are not having any space in the anatomy. Every region of the anatomy is covered, and that's equal to pitch of 1. Generally, for a lot of the body protocol, we can get away with a pitch greater than 1, which means the table is traveling faster than the beam width. Let's say the table is traveling at 60 millimeter per rotation. You divide that by the 32 millimeter of the beam width, you get a pitch of almost close to 1.5, 1.6. So here, a pitch greater than 1 implies an extending imaging, which has reduced radiation dose and with certain lower axial resolution. There are scenarios where we use a pitch very less than 1, close to 0.2 and 0.3 like in cardiac CT, where it has an implies overlapping and higher patient dose with improved axial resolution. So one of the fundamental factors is the radiation dose is inversely proportional to the pitch. Keeping all other factors, the pitch factor will automatically have an indirect relationship with respect to dose. Conceptually, if the pitch is less than 1 means the same anatomy is overlapped, therefore the pitch will be higher compared to pitch greater than 1 where you have a gap in the anatomy. One caveat to the whole definition of this pitch is there is this concept called effective MAS. Certain CT scanners, especially Siemens and also Philips, uses the concept called effective MAS, where the effective MAS is equal to MAS divided the pitch, and you wrap this inside so that the image quality is not affected, and the user only selects effective MAS, the scanner will automatically choose between the MA and seconds. Those are the fundamental factors. So the next part of the lecture, I'm going to cover more on the CT dose measurement. First and foremost is, especially this aspect is surprise to our physician colleague, because the CT dose we mentioned for the patient is not measured directly on patients. The CT dose is measured using standard phantoms. The phantoms are materials that mimic human tissues, and the measurements are then used to estimate patient dose. So when I speak to physicians about a patient dose, I'm always cautious to mention is the estimated patient dose, because we are only giving an estimation because we are not directly measuring anything on the patient. So let's imagine now, if you're doing a CT scan, and let's say a single slice of a 10 millimeter slice, ideally the radiation dose delivered should be only to the imaging volume like a square block. In reality, we see more like distributed, more like a bell-shaped curve. Therefore, if we had to do a dosimetry, we need to make sure that we are not only capturing this peak of this area, but also the tail, the dose tails from either side of this particular slice. And that's important to understand because that's how we do the CT dosimetry to account for the dose tails when we are doing a measurement using the phantoms. So when we do only single slice, a single image, or a one particular slice, or only one scan, we have a bell-shaped curve like this. When we have a multiple of them, we have this distribution extending beyond the actual volume of the area, so the tail extends on either side, and that has to be captured. So back around in 70s, there is a definition called CTDI, Computed Tomography Dose Index. Here is shown as CTDI FDA, because the Food and Drug Administration FDA, the medical physicist in FDA, derived this particular definition. This basically showing it calculates area under a single dose distribution curve and divide the area by the number of slices and the slice width. So here the CTDI is defined for plus or minus 7 slices on either side of this particular central image to make sure that all the dose tails are captured. The CTDI unit is milligray. In reality, we use what is called as CTDI unread. Shown here is the picture of a standard CTDI phantom, which most of you may be familiar. And these are, from the time the CT were developed, has been the standard in a way when we measure CTDI, most of all of us around the globe, we know it's all measured on these standard phantoms. CTDI 100 allows for more practical measurement of dose index when compared to using TLD or films, which is more complex TLDs. So we use what is called as a 100 millimeter long pencil ionization chamber. This pencil ionization chamber, which is 100 millimeter long, is placed in the standard phantoms, which is a 32 centimeter diameter phantom at different location to measure the CT output of the scanner, from which we calculate the CTDI, measure the CTDI 100. So these phantoms are used and they're placed at isocenter on the scanner, and we typically measure it using an axial scan, one single image at the center of the phantom. And this one single axial image is used to measure the CTDI using this 100. So the standard phantoms have been used as the 32 centimeter body phantom, a 16 centimeter diameter called as the head phantom. The length is about 16 centimeter or 15 centimeters in length, these phantoms are. We also have the small phantom, pediatric phantom, which is about 10 centimeter in diameter. Just want to clarify a couple of things. One is, in a typical radiograph, there is a radiation dose gradients difference between radiography, fluoroscopy versus CT. Because in radiograph and fluoroscopy, the radiation dose gradient is maximum at the skin entrance surface and decreases as it goes through the patient. So typically on an average size patient, the exit dose is about 15% of the entrance dose. On the other hand, in CT, the gradient is different because the CT tube is acquiring data around the patient. Therefore, this maximum dose you see is around the patient on this entrance surface area, whereas at the center of the patient, it's much lesser. This has to be accounted when we are doing CT dosimetry, because the typical dose distribution in CT is as follows. For a small size object such as the head phantom, whether you measure at the center of the phantom or at the surface of the phantom is pretty much the same. On the other hand, if you're measuring on a large body phantom, the surface dose is almost twice that of the central dose. So when we are using CTDI, we need to account for the differences in this particular measurement. And that particular difference in measurement is accounted, and a new dose descriptor is defined called the CTDI weighted. Basically, computed tomography dose index, which is a weighted average of the center and the periphery dose. So the way it's been defined as CTDI weighted is equal to 2/3 of the center of the edge dose using the 100 millimeter ionization chamber and 1/3 of the CTDI at 100. Now, let's say most of the CT scans we do is a helical scan. Therefore, when we say helical scan, the concept of pitch arrives, which we explained earlier. That has to be taken into account in the CTDI weighted, and we introduce a dose descriptor called CTDI volume. And this is an estimate of an average patient dose of a single slice. So the CTDI volume is defined as the ratio of the CTDI weighted divided by the pitch. And the CTDI weighted is measurement from one axial scan. When you take into pitch, we have an estimate on an average patient dose. So what we have is some of the fundamental factors are CTDI 100 is measured with 100 millimeter ion chamber. CTDI volume is not measured directly. It's actually calculated. It is based on the CTDI weighted, and it is measured from a single axial acquisition, but calculated with the pitch value. Most of all the manufacturers, when they provide or when they supply the new scanner, in their manual, they do provide CT dosimetry data. Very exhaustively measurements are done, and they are provided. In a way, this becomes one of the fundamental acceptance tests for a medical physicist when a new scanner is accepted in the clinic, is to measure and verify whether the dose output is similar to what the manufacturer specification tells. Here's an example showing the CT dosimetry data measured at different location on this particular scanner. One of the ways I do it normally is I set up the technique as the same technique as the manufacturers and trying to mimic the measurement value to make sure the CT scanner is producing what it is supposed to produce. Is one of the required acceptance test measurement for the CT scanner, and they do have factors, conversion factor for different techniques and different slice thicknesses, different beam acquisition mode, and so forth. So now, as we all know, we don't do one single scan on a patient. We do a number of scans on a patient to calculate, to account for the actual exposure on the patient. We introduce a term called dose length product, DLP. This represents an integrated dose in terms of total scan length. And it's also related to the energy imparted, but more intuitive than using an energy units like joules. Because, you know, the DLP is defined as the product of the CTDI volume, which is expressed in milligray, multiplied by the scan length, which is expressed in centimeter. So the unit of DLP is milligray centimeter. Here are two scenarios. In these two scenarios, the CTDI volume is the same because the same technique was used. Per slice is the same. However, in the top figure, only 10 slices were done, whereas in the bottom one, 20 slices were done. So in order to account the actual amount of radiation exposure to the patient, the DLP is an indicator of the biological risk to the body. So the DLP becomes one of the key dose descriptors. So the DLP is expressed in milligray centimeter, and it can increase from the increase in scan length, or it also have an increase with the CTDI itself. So what we see here is like the CTDI 100 is the fundamental measurement using a 100 millimeter chamber. Then we calculate the CTDI weighted, divide this by the pitch, we get the CTDI volume, multiply that by the length of the scan, we get DLP. The dose length, from there, we arrive at the effective dose or organ doses and so forth in a different way. So the key dose descriptors in CT are computed tomography dose index expressed in milligray and dose length product expressed in milligray centimeter. Nowadays, on all the scanners, we can see both of them either before the scan or after the scan. So what we see here is like, this is a pre-scan display. When the technology is setting the parameter, the CTDI volume is also available there, especially when we are doing a manual technique, not a modulator technique. In this display, it shows both the CTDI volume for this particular technique and the type of phantom used. On a post-scan display, each manufacturer has produced one screenshot image, like an image, which has the details of the technique used for different scan procedures on a particular scan time. And more details are also available in the DICOM headers information, which physicists can access and find a lot more details. I'm not going to go into the details of this SSDI because that's a topic for another discussion. We know that CTDI volume is not patient dose, and it is fixed on a fixed size on a phantom. Therefore, AAPM, American Association of Physicists in Medicine report of 2004 introduced a parameter called size-specific dose estimate to allow estimation of patient dose based on the CTDI and patient size. And that's a different discussion for another day. What I want to show here is like, where is the risk? How is the risk calculated? When they say risk, this is what people think about radiation. So therefore, it becomes important how we calculate the risk. One way the risk is calculated is by the organ doses. But also, there is another called the effective dose. Because the effective dose in a wave is a single dose parameter which reflects the risk of a non-uniform exposure in terms of a whole body exposure. And this provides a way to compare risk with other types of exposure. Means you can if the radiation dose estimation is given in terms of the effective dose, you can compare the risk from background radiation exposure or a nuclear medicine procedure exposure or any type of exposure. So how is effective dose calculated? It's a lengthy process. You start with this First of all, the CTDI, the dose in phantom per slice. Then you take the length and scan and the pitch value. We can get the DLP. From DLP, we can calculate the effective dose and is expressed in millisievert or REM. From there, we can calculate a theoretical risk for the patient. There are multiple ways of calculating the effective dose. Now it's getting more sophisticated. There's software available and even more based on Monte Carlo simulation. There are impact dose calculators based on anthropomorphic size phantoms. And there is also a simple way called as the conversion factor or the K factor. And the K factors is basically are defined for certain body parts and they're expressed in millisievert times divided by the milligray centimeter. Here is an effective dose estimation with impact dose CT dose calculator. And here are the standard conversion factors for different body part: head, neck, chest, abdomen, and pelvic. The word of caution is this is right now the most commonly used K factors, but this is about to change in due course because these K factors were derived with the older scanner in a single slice scanners and the anthropomorphic phantoms. There are some discussion for the change in the factors. However, as of now, these are the K factors used for normally calculating the effective dose for a standard body factor. Head, neck, chest, abdomen, and pelvic. Why is this of more interest? Because if you look at the type of CT scanners we do in the clinic, more than 75% of all the CT scans done are head, chest, abdomen, and pelvic. And that's why this is more commonly defined for these particular standard one. In the literature, you can find conversion factors for extremity scans and other things also. One can, as a physicist, we can quickly provide an effective dose estimation by the dose charts and multiply by the respective conversion factor to arrive at the effective dose value. Here are some reference values which is used in the US for accrediting a CT scanner. The American College of Radiology has an accrediting program for CT scanner where the sites had to scan their phantom for their particular protocols for CT of the head, abdomen, and pelvic. And these are the reference levels given so that the protocol should not exceed more than these values given as pass fail, thereby giving an opportunity for the site to optimize their protocol. One final point which I want to draw is like the effective dose is calculated including the tissue weighting factor. And the tissue weighting factor had changed recently compared to the ICRP 60 and ICRP 103. You can see the weighting factor changed remarkably from breast from 0.05 to 0.12. And for gonads, it went down from 0.20 to 0.08. Why is this important? This has an implication on the way we calculate the effective dose because the tissue weighting factors are included in the effective dose calculation. So in the NCRP 184, we estimated the effective dose based on both the tissue weighting factors. And here in this table shown for the type of CT scanner, the most remarkable change was in the chest CT because the breast tissues weighting factor changed from 0.05 to 1.20. Therefore, a chest CT estimation in the previous weighting factor is approximately 5.4 millisievert. Now with the new weighting factor, it comes to 6.1 millisievert. And the gonads slightly decreased from 8.7 to 7.6. So that's one of the reasons why we try to, as a physicist, we try to keep those descriptors only CTDI weight volume and DLP and allow the physicist to calculate the effective dose or organ dose from there. So here are different scan parameters and their relationship to CTDI volume. I'm not going to read this out. It's basically summarizing what we studied up till now, how this each of the factors implies. John, can I take 2 more minutes to introduce this CTDI dose modulation?
Please go ahead.
Okay. The reason why I want to introduce this CT dose modulation because all the scans these days we are doing are modulated. So what is modulation? With the concern of radiation dose from CT, there is an effort to see how much amount of X-rays we need to scan a patient. So since most of us are elliptical in shape, we need higher X-ray attenuation in the lateral direction compared to the AP direction. This particular aspect is used for reducing the radiation dose by changing the radiation dose based on the location on the scanner. There are two types of dose modulation. One is called the spatial dose modulation. The second one is called the temporal dose modulation. I'm not going to spend too much time on the temporal dose modulation because that is very much confined to cardiac CT only. Majority of all the dose modulation, when we say, it's spatial dose modulation. So what is spatial dose modulation? The spatial dose modulation is basically allowing the scanner to modulate the tube current at different spatial projection. In a way, changing the tube current based on the patient thickness. And that is utilized in most routine body CT protocol. The second type of modulation is used in cardiac CT, where we modulate the tube current at specified time points on the ECG signal, which is for another day. So here is shown here, the scanner automatically changes the tube current based on the patient thickness. As you can see here on the graph, above graph, you see the tube current increases around the shoulder area, it decreases around the lung area, and again increases around the pelvic area based on the patient thickness. One word of caution is each manufacturer does this modulation very slightly differently. So as a medical physicist, it's important for us to understand how the modulation works for a respective CT scanner. Otherwise, we can incorrectly set these specified parameters. One example, for a Siemens scanner, they use what is called as a reference MAS. What it basically tells is like, if you're doing an abdominal CT, you set the reference MAS to a certain level, allowing the scanner to vary the tube current around that reference level point. GE scanner use what is called as a noise index. They use a noise index, means how much of the image noise is allowed in a final image, and allow the scanner to automatically change the tube current. So it is very important for us to understand how this parameter works when we are setting these as a reference values as we go along. The caveat is, with the patient with a prosthesis or metal, automatically the scanner will increase the dose very high. So therefore one has to be careful when we're doing this pregnant patient or patient with prosthesis and so forth. But when we are displaying the dose display at the end of the scan, which is given a CTDI volume, is actually an average tube current throughout the scan. It's not particular at particular value, but it's more like an average tube current. So let me stop here and conclude. The radiation dose in CT are best expressed in CTDI volume, unit is milligray, and dose length product. Right now we use effective dose, which can be derived from DLP using conversion factor. It is important to understand the CTDI dose index is not patient dose, and understanding how the parameters work is equally important, which can affect both image quality and dose. Thank you, and once again, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Mahesh. Let me switch off my camera.
Can I stop this sharing?
It's okay, up to you. I mean, you can leave your slides on. So it's impressive. The number of participants during your talk ranged from 560 to 630. Much greater than the audience of sessions of large congresses. And this is great, of course. This is very, very good. Many questions. I have grouped them, and I'll try to in the beginning, in the group chat, some comments and questions were about tube load and image quality, and I think this is clear that increasing the tube load, by increasing the tube load, we increase the dose, which will decrease noise and improve the contrast resolution. There is a question. There are many questions, of course. One is about possible resources to practically implement optimization. I guess the question is, do we have tools? Do we have to help us to support optimization?
Yes, there are multiple websites available. One space I would like to invite is the AAPM, American Association of Physicists, has a free web page which basically lists all the protocols for different manufacturers. And this website is a good resource to start with because this was developed by a committee which includes medical physicists and manufacturers together, developing protocols for the most standard protocols, head, chest, abdomen, and perfusion and cardiac CT, basically listing how each manufacturers can be set to provide the equivalent dose. That's one side. The second one is the Image Gently website, which is especially for pediatric. There are a lot of optimization techniques available, which many medical physicists can explore. Both of them are freely available. One is the AAPM website for CT protocols. One can download the protocol for the respective scanner. In fact, these scanners range from anywhere from single slice all the way to 320 scanners for different manufacturers. So they are very helpful tools.
Thank you. Could you please comment, another question, could you comment on pencil chambers and phantoms, standard 10 centimeter pencil chambers versus longer?
Yes.
I think this question is good.
Yes.
Very good. CT dosimetry is still based on CTDI 100, which underestimates those. So would you like to comment?
I will comment. Especially, I didn't have time to explain these. Especially with the new scanner, which are going beyond this length of the phantom, like the 320 Canon 320 scanner or the GE 256 scanner. Each beam width is larger than the actual phantom. So there are two ways. One is you can either buy multiple CTDI phantom and use a longer ionization chamber, like 300 millimeter chamber, or there are publications which has provided what the conversion factors between using a regular 100 millimeter ionization chamber, and they seem to be slightly, you can use a conversion factor to measure using a 100 millimeter ionization chamber with a single phantom, almost equivalent to this larger phantom. So to answer it correctly, there is a paper, we can put it up on the website, which has this conversion factor very simply showing that whether you are using a 300 millimeter or a 100, you can actually correct the CTDA volume you measure using a 100 millimeter to this larger phantom. The reason is like it's very expensive to buy a larger ionization chamber and carry all these phantom. On the other way, you can use this conversion factor to use the measurement even on a 100 millimeter chamber. I hope I answered this one.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try to cover as many as possible questions. They are still coming.
Yeah.
So another question is about phantoms and those phantoms. Why is the dose uniform between center and periphery when using 16 centimeter diameter phantoms?
The reason is like, again, is the gradient. If the object is a smaller, it's almost the same. The gradient, the dose going at the center and the periphery is almost the same. And this can be demonstrated by doing simple measurement. But that's what we do when we do the measurement. One can actually see on a head phantom, which is a small size, the surface and the center dose is almost the same. At the same time, on a large phantom, this is the dose gradient we see. What is the clinical implication? On a large size patient sometime, if we see sometime a photon, very noisy image in the center, which is called the photon starvation. And that's purely because of the less number of photons are reaching the central area. And that's why we account for these differences. So smaller the size, it doesn't matter whether the surface or the center, but larger the object or the patient, the central dose is much lesser than the surface, purely because of the absorption and scattering of the radiation entering the patient.
Thank you. Another question, COVID, do we need specific scan parameters?
For which one?
COVID-19, coronavirus.
Oh, okay.
For chest, I guess
okay.
For chest protocols, do we need specific parameters?
Not necessarily, like for any of these pneumonia cases or a high contrast resolution, high resolution scans are done. So there is no specific parameters. Sometimes I've seen some papers doing very low dose to decrease the dose. Compared to the clinical situation, I would not change a typical, we have been doing a typical chest CT, high resolution chest CT protocol, which we use for all the studying the pneumonia case and everything. Is the same techniques can be used.
Great. 3 or 4 questions about DLP to effective dose conversion factors.
Yes.
Important topic.
Yes.
One question is, do they take into account dual tube systems? Our colleague says, I think it's an important question because we should also discuss about accuracy. How accurate is this method? And do you recommend the use of effective dose? Because we use this method to estimate effective dose. So is it possible to...
Sure. Let me comment. First of all, if we talk about effective dose, we can spend an hour arguing about this plus and minus. In the absence of any other method right now, that's the best available system to express an effective dose. The advantage, it gives a simple unit which can be compared with all other type of radiation. With regard to the conversion factor, it has a lot of limitations. The reason is like these were developed back with the single slice CT scanners. Again, this is impacted by those scanners with the Bowtie filter, filtration, and so forth. And then it also depends, it is also not updated to the newer scanners, the multi-detector scanner, and definitely not for the dual energy CT scanner. One example I'll tell you, for the chest CT, especially with the new weighting factors, with the new tissue weighting factor, the conversion factor for chest has to be almost double. There are multiple publications which are done using phantom and measured, and they're demonstrated the K factor has to go almost double the number. The reason why I did not show it here right now is I didn't want to confuse the audience by showing these conversion factor, which are now published in the literature all over the place, but it is not uniformly accepted. So it is not fair for a clinic to use some new factor and which will automatically demonstrate a very high dose compared to what the standard literature is using. Until the international bodies change the Chi factor, we'll be stuck with the same conversion factor for some more time. However, it is not accurate. That's why the effective dose when we estimate in CT, it has an uncertainty close to 40%. So there's a large uncertainty, but it's good for a first generation of calculation, but not for accurate calculation. Again, how do you say accurate? Because we are not doing anything with the patient. We are basically using phantoms, and we are arriving at these things, and that's where this effective dose estimate and uncertainty comes into picture.
Good. Well, there are many questions about if we are going to upload the webinar on IOMP's website. Yes, as I mentioned in the beginning, the webinar will be available after this event on our website. A lot of questions. I'm afraid. I apologize. Some questions will remain unanswered. Impossible to answer all questions of a session with more than 600 participants. Okay, last question. It's Professor Mahesh. Oops, something.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry. I think I will. Anyway, something happened and the chat window disappeared from my screen. Are the risk factors for the body organs very well known? I mean, can you comment about the risk factors? How can convert body organs, convert those to risk?
So one of the controversial issue with the effective dose or this medical imaging doses are we do not have good evidence for the risks at the low dose levels. We do have some biological risk increases when the persons have received more than 200, 300 millisievert of dose as expressed as observed in the atomic bomb survivor. However, since we use the linear no threshold model, LNT model, we extrapolate the risk all the way down to the level of medical imaging doses. Medical imaging doses can range from anywhere from 0.1 millisievert to 30 millisievert in a typical medical imaging procedures. Therefore, in this particular range, we do not have good biological evidence for risk, and that's where a lot of this controversy happens. There are a variety of models can fit into this one, such as a linear quadratic equation or linear model. But to answer your question, we do not have direct evidence. But for organ doses from nuclear medicine studies, we do have some threshold on the organ doses, which cannot exceed, which can cause damage to the patient. But in CT, we do not have a well-documented risk for a typical CT imaging or medical imaging range of doses.
Great. We have an avalanche of messages thanking you for this excellent presentation.
It's my pleasure.
It's time to close the session. I'd like to thank you for your excellent talk. All of our colleagues for their very active participation. Tomorrow, same time, another webinar on proton therapy. Have a nice day or sleep well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.